For loops are a common way to iterate over a sequence of elements, such as a list or a range of numbers, in many programming languages. However, in Python, for loops are often redundant and can be replaced with more concise and efficient alternatives. In this tutorial, we will explore some of the reasons why for loops are redundant in Python and how to use more efficient alternatives. Let's look at an example. Here we have a list of numbers, and then we want to take the square of each number in the list. We could implement this using a simple for loop. So basically here we define a new list called squared underscore numbers, and this is initially empty. Then using this for loop, we are iterating with each item in this number list, taking the square of the number and simply appending it to the new list that we created, right? So this is how you would implement a simple for loop in Python. However, if the list, the original list grows too large, then the for loops is going to be pretty slow. So there are some alternatives in Python that you can use to actually expedite this process. Python has built-in functions that can iterate over sequences of elements without the need for explicit loops. For example, the map function can apply a given function to each element of a list or other sequence, returning a new sequence of results. So here is an example of using the map function instead of a for loop to square the value of each element in the list. The way it was working is we have defined this lambda function which accepts an element and then returns its square. So using the map function, we are taking the original list and then basically passing one item at a time to this lambda function, which takes the square of that item and returns it using the map object. So this is a very concise way of converting the same for loop operation into a very concise and readable map function implementation. Just to reiterate, you can see that the map function applies the lambda function, which is basically taking the square, to each element in the numbers list. This is equivalent to writing a for loop that iterates over the list, square each element, and append it to a new list. But it is much more concise and readable. Another alternative to for loops is the list comprehension in Python, which is a concise and efficient way to create new lists by applying a given function to each element in an existing list or a sequence. So here is an example of list comprehension instead of for loop to square the value of each item in the list. The way it's working is a list comprehension is basically defined using these square brackets, and it has two parts. The first part is the for loop, right? And the second part is the operation that you want to perform. So here, if you were to decode this, it takes each element using this for loop and simply square that element and append it to these new list that will be created at the end. If you run this code, you will get exactly the same result as before. As you can see, the list comprehension applies the square function to each element in the numbers list, creating a new list of the squared numbers. This is equivalent to writing a for loop that iterates over the list squares each element and append it to the new list, but it is much more concise and readable. In summary, for loops are often redundant in Python due to the built-in functions and more concise alternatives such as maps, filters, and list comprehension. It's always better to use the built-in functions and alternatives whenever possible to make your code more readable, efficient, and less prone to errors. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching and happy coding.